Okay, everyone, let's begin. We have a decent amount of stuff to get through, so we'll just get moving. So welcome back. A couple announcements before we get into it. Number one, don't forget to indicate your interest in the book club books. I want to get those in your hands as soon as possible. So if you haven't yet, by the end of the day, try to get on there and indicate which of those 6 books you'd like to read. I think I'll have enough to get everyone either their first or second choice, but I'll at least try to get as close to that as possible. Right. Also, I do have some news that'll probably bum you out, but I want to let you know that I heard from the higher ups, the suits at the district central office, that next week we have to administer the CDT. Some of you probably felt this was coming because I think you're doing it in math class, but we're going to be doing it here as well. I know a lot of you wrote about for your op-eds how there's too much standardized testing. Frankly, I agree with you, but it's a information that the district wants, and I do think that it does tell you something about how good your reading skills are. So it's a helpful measuring stick for them to have. People do collect that data and use it. I see it, and it's guidance gets it, and it helps make decisions about, whether you go into honors or AP or CC. So it's helpful for us to have. So I appreciate your patience as we go through that. Probably we'll spend I'll set aside 3 days next week for that first 3 days. And what I'd like to happen is, you could take that, and then when you finish it, you can start reading your book club book. So we'll use the first few days, finish the CDTs, and get started reading. So there's that book club. Yeah, that's about it. So yesterday we talked about the poem Still I Rise, and today we're going to be continuing talking about poetry, looking at a new piece called If We Must Die, which sounds morbid, but actually isn't really. So let me pull up the assignment, or the PowerPoint. All right, so we'll be looking at If We Must Die, in particular, use of phonic effects, sound in the poem. We'll also spend the second half of class talking about how to properly embed quotes in a paper, how to use evidence correctly so the evidence flows smoothly, makes sense, and is effective for conveying your point. So If We Must Die, no video this time. I'll just read it out loud. That'll be our first run through. So this first time through, really just pay attention to sound. What do you hear? What are your first impressions? What sort of emotions seem to be conveyed? What idea is the poet trying to get across? I've also put this on Canvas. There's a Word doc with it. So if you want to read it and follow along, you can. I don't know about you personally. I find it distracting listening to something and trying to read it at the same time. So if you want to just listen, that's fine. Okay, so afterwards, I'll just ask for general impressions. But this is If We Must Die by Claude McKay. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What, though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. All right, so that's If We Must Die. It's like Still I Rise. It's a very kind of rhythmic, interesting kind of punchy, motivational sort of poem. So Sophia, you raised your hand during the reading. Oh, that's
Yeah, I not mean to.
oh, there you go. No problem.
Thank you.
So what are your general impressions? First thoughts about it, just what stood out to you? Yeah, go ahead, Minkus.
Of course. I kind of get like the impression like in a movie where there's like an action movie like the Marvel movies, for example, like everything seems lost, and then there's just like this miraculous turnaround where there's one person who's inspiring everyone else to join the fight and then just turn the tide of the war.
Yeah, great. That's exactly what I think of too. If any of you are like ancient history buffs, or if any of you have seen the movie 300, I always think of the movie 300. Actually, it's about the Battle of Thermopylae. There are 300 Greek soldiers outnumbered, 1,000 to 1 against this Persian army, and they take this heroic last stand. They know they're going to die, but they're trying to defend their home because it's the right thing to do. Or like a charge of the Light Brigade, kind of lost cause, heroic last stand kind of feeling is really nicely evoked by the poem. Norman, what did you notice?
It's just talking about man is mortal, so make the most of it.
Sorry, you kind of trailed off at the end there. What were you going to say?
Man is mortal, so make the most of it.
I heard man is mortal and then some other stuff, but certainly it's a reflection on death and like, how do you want to go? Do you want to go out with a bang or a whimper? Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other thoughts? Those are both good. Okay, cool. So let me go back to the PowerPoint. So that was our first run through. I'll let you read it again and do a deeper dive and start to notice new things. One of the things that I'm trying to get across to you with these sorts of activities and classes, I'm going to ask you questions, but the place I want you to be is where you don't have to have a teacher field you questions, that you're able to notice things yourself. You see certain patterns that generate ideas. And so you're able to have your own ideas, to have your own thoughts, which is the point of education. Okay. But let me give you some guiding questions that'll hopefully lead to a richer discussion. So as you're reading it again, consider these three things. First, if you were to split up the poem into 3 sections, where would you put those dividing lines, those 2 dividing lines for the 3 sections? Next, there's a set of lines in the middle here, line 7 and 8, says, then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. What's the meaning of those 2 lines? And lastly, when do you think this was written? If you had to take a guess, which century do you think it took place in? No wrong answers here, just a thought. Okay, so you could just answer these questions in your head. Take like 3 minutes or so, reread the poem, see if you could answer these. Think about anything else interesting that you notice, and then we will discuss. Okay, go ahead. some time to go over it again and come up with some ideas. So let's talk about what's happening here. I'm going to share the poem and I'll annotate it as we're reading. So my first question was, how would you divide up this poem? So if you were to put 2 lines here to split it into 3 sections, where would you put them? Let's go with Norman. And Norman, which color should I use?
Let's go with the purple.
Purple, you got it. And where would you put that first line?
I would put the line right above "O kinsman."
Here?
Yeah, right over the top to divide.
Okay. I agree with you on that one. Where would you put the other one?
I didn't think that deeply yet.
Okay. Well, let's just stick with that for now. I agree that I think one of them should go there. And why there?
So I chose there because beforehand he's kind of rambling, but then when he sends "O kinsman," he's kind of digressing and recalling the attention to the present, and then he talks about the present situation in front of them, which is the outnumbered situation and the cowardly pack.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I like that you're noticing this exclamation of "O kinsman," kind of like the kinsman is like family members. Like that is almost like a piece of punctuation that marks the start of a new section. Yes. So I think that makes sense, but where should we put the other line? How about Claudia?
Right before line 5, like above "if we must die."
Good. Yeah.
And I guess I think that because at first they're talking about like how they're not gonna die, and then from there it shifts to like how they should die with a noble death that like leaves something.
Yeah, good. So I think that makes sense. Deja, you had your hand up too. Do you agree with that? And are there any other clues that might cue us into why the lines should be there?
I agree with what both Norman and Claudia said, but I would have put those lines there for different reasons. I
Sure.
was going based off of the rhyming scheme. Yes, it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, but because the sounds that you're rhyming change, that's where you should split the poem into those 3 sections, strictly because of the rhyming scheme changing throughout the poem, along with what Claudia and Norman.
Good. Yeah. So I'm glad that you noticed that it is A, B, A, B. C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Hey, what kind of poem is that? Someone shout it out.
Sonnet.
Good. Yeah, it is a sonnet. So
Sonnet.
probably the type of poem that you're most familiar with. So it is a sonnet. And we're used to sonnets being love poems. So this might be a little unusual that it's this kind of rallying cry for some doomed soldiers. So, you know, those would be the clues that would tell me to divide it up here, the way the rhyme scheme is divided. And then I would also look at the starting phrases, you know, "if we must die," "if we must die" is repeated here. And each of these chunks of 4 lines, those are all sentences, right? Individual sentences. So that's another clue that's a logical place to break up the poem. So this is a good tactic if you're dealing with a complex piece of writing. Break it into smaller, manageable chunks, and then take it chunk by chunk as you try to figure out what's happening. So let's look at this first section. "If we must die, let it not be like hogs." Okay. So how would you explain this first section? There is one extended simile here that's conveying the main idea. So how is that? Why is that simile chosen? Why is it appropriate? What's the idea it's conveying? Okay, go ahead, Claudia.
I think that since the pigs are penned up, they've already reached their fate and there's nothing for them to do. It's like they're cornered, and that might be the same thing that the author is feeling, that like they're cornered, they have no other thing, they're going to die. So, and like when pigs go out and die, they kind of like squeal and like it's not very honorable. So
Hmm.
that's what I was thinking.
Good. You might kind of get Lord of the Flies vibes from this. Like Jack hunting these pigs, who, you have pigs, you have these mad and hungry dogs. The pigs aren't going to stand a chance, right? So this is what you don't want to be like. You don't want to be like this vulnerable, helpless pig cornered in, waiting to be ripped apart by the dogs. So this is like what they're trying to avoid, right? That's the idea here. You don't want to die shamefully. Instead, this is how you should die, right? That brings us to the next section. So what is he explaining is the way that they should die. And also, right, I asked you about this line here, then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. What does that mean too? Claudia's all over this, but I want to hear from someone new. Sorry, Claudia. Heard from Norman too. Come on, guys. All right, Norman, go ahead.
This is kind of a sketchy shot, but I'm going to say that it means that because you're already dead, the monsters you used to fear are not scary anymore.
Well, I agree that they wouldn't be scared of you anymore if you were dead, but I don't think that's quite what he's going for. Appreciate the effort, though. It's good. Colin, what do you think?
Well, Mr. Feeney, I think I think it's trying to say go out in a way that is not going to be shameful and prove to them that you are not afraid of death, and trying to show that that you are not worthless, that you have honor. You trying to prove to them something before you go.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, I could never live up to Mr. Feeney, by the way. But yeah, I think the idea there is right. But maybe we could get like a little more specific about what these two lines mean. Claudia, you want to build on that?
Yeah, what I was saying was kind of similar to what Colin said, but I was just thinking that, if they're going to die, make it be with dignity so that when it goes down in history, even the enemy has to respect on it and look back on it and be like, and realize they were in the wrong and what they did was honorable.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's one thing to have your friends and family mourn you and honor you after you died, but you want to put up such a good fight that your opponent even says, "Wow, you know what? I'm glad we won, but respect." They have our respect and honor. So that's the manner in which they should go. And then this last section kind of just expands on that, ending with this nice couplet. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, crest to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Right? Go out in a blaze of glory. What's cowardly about the enemy? Why cowardly? Right? They're fighting, they're winning. Seems like that's not necessarily cowardly. So what might be cowardly about the opponents? Okay, Claudia.
The reason they're fighting could be for something for their own personal gain, like greed, and it's not really honorable, so it could be viewed as cowardly.
Okay, maybe we could infer that these are bad guys who are out to help themselves and they're not fighting for a good cause. That's fair. Let me ask a follow-up question though. How scary is it to fight an enemy who is very outnumbered? That might help answer this question. Does it take a lot of bravery to fight in an army of 10,000 people if you're fighting against an army of 100 people? You're all thinking, no, like doesn't. It doesn't take a lot of effort to do that. So there's safety in numbers, but there's also less honor in numbers. So they're saying they're kind of like the few, the righteous few who are fighting for what's right, dying for an honorable cause. So it's a nice little poem, and it has all these rhymes. It's set out in a stanza as a sonnet. It doesn't necessarily feel like a sonnet though, right? It feels very rhythmic and rousing. Like it flows really well. It has this kind of cool sound quality. Anyone notice anything about the word choice that would give it that kind of flowing, rousing quality? What patterns do you notice in the types of words that Claude McKay uses to give the poem a certain type of feel or sound? Yeah, Jacob?
Well, like up to the second to last line, there's only like one long word per line, which makes everything like easier to like say out loud because all the words are much shorter. And then there's just like one word to like focus on that is a bit longer for each line. So I think that makes it like flow more and easier to like say out loud rather than just read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you, and I think that's deliberate. I mean, even look at the first line. If we must die, let it not be like hogs. Like all of those are single syllable words, right? It has that. It's almost like each word emphasizes itself because it's so short, and it feels direct and simple. It's something that a fifth grader could understand. It's like he's talking to the crowd. This is not someone who's overly academic or emotional. It's not filled with all of these SAT words, right? It's kind of the language of common people. You might also notice a lot of, if you're looking closely, you might notice a lot of sound repetition. So here we'll look at the last section. O kinsman, we must meet the common foe. Though outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? So all those O's, and those contrast with some harsh consonants in it, kind of create this sense of unity and a sense of repetition that just makes it like flow really well. Okay, let me end with this question. Anyone have an idea of when this poem might have been written? I'll tell you what, put your guesses in the chat. Like which century? You want to say the 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s? Just post in the chat whatever you think. I'm getting 1800s, 1200s, 1900s, 1800s, a lot of 1800s. 1500s. Jacob's cheating, already knows this author. It's okay. 1700s. Yeah, so usually when I ask this question, like most people will say like 1500s, 1600s. I mean, it's a sonnet, which is an older form of poem, and it has all these O's, right, that sound sound kind of old. But actually, this was written in the 1900s. This is a 20th century poem. So Claude McKay wrote this in 1919. He was a poet in the Harlem Renaissance, actually, and he like studied older literature extensively and tried to recreate that feeling of older writing this. And he wrote this in part about the struggles of the civil rights movement. That being said, the thing I like about this poem is it kind of feels universal. Like it could be about any kind of struggle of the little guy against the outnumbered little guy. So you know, it's always going to be applicable to something. Good guesses. All right, so here's what I want to do. Let's transition now. Running a little short on time, so I'll try to explain this all quickly. So if you have a poem like this that you're trying to write about for an assignment, you always want to use quotes, use facts to back up what you're saying. As many quotes as possible when you're making an argument. Now, if you're writing something like the op-ed, or you're, I don't know, in a science class, you're going to use studies to support your argument. In English class, you want to use quotes or use what's actually said. The big picture here is that whenever you're trying to make a claim, you always want to have that claim be based in reality, right? Be based in fact, be based in evidence. The more you can do that, the better. But you don't want to just throw facts in. You want them to be smoothly integrated in, so they flow, so they make sense, so people know what you're talking about. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, whenever you drop a quote in, you need to have that quote introduced. You need to have the actual quote that's properly cited. And you need to have a comment or an explanation of the quote. Right. So this is sort of based on some problems that I saw in the op-ed. Applies to that. It also applies to writing about poetry. So here are two different examples that illustrate part of the problem. So quotes need to be embedded. You'll hear me say this a lot. You might see me say, type it as feedback on one of your papers. You know, look at the difference between these two. I'm kind of using an exaggerated example here, but this one is incorrect. This one is correct. And the big difference is just these two words, she writes. So the difference is that in this version, the quote is just kind of dropped into the middle of the paragraph. You know, it is not smoothly embedded. It's not introduced. It's just this random sentence. Here, the quote is inside of a sentence of the author's own writing. Right? She writes is technically a complete sentence, and the quote is part of that sentence. Right? So quotes always need to be a part of a sentence that you wrote as the author of your paper. Okay, that's the first thing to keep in mind. I call those quote tags. You always need to have a quote tag with a quote. But the location can vary. It can be at the beginning of the quote, it can be somewhere in the middle, it can be at the end, but it needs to be there somewhere. And it can be short as that. It could be a little longer. It's up to you. Also, just like with the op-ed, any kind of quote needs to have a citation at the end. The citation is basically a way to prove that you got the source from somewhere. And it lets me track down where the quote is. In case I don't believe you, this helps me make sure that you're not just making things up. So what should be in a quote? Well, for us, those quotes will always be in parentheses. Note that there is only one period and it comes at the end of the parentheses. You will never have a period or comma here if the quote is at the end of the sentence. Never a period, never a comma. There are a couple of exceptions. If the quote is a question and there's a question mark here, then you would keep the question mark. If there's an exclamation point, you would keep the exclamation point, but no periods, no commas. Note that for poetry, you would have, instead of page numbers, you would write lines. Lines is lowercase, and then you put the lines with a hyphen in between. So this quote is from lines 3, 4 of Still I Rise. And then there's one period, it's after the parentheses. And then here's something unique to writing about poetry. Poetry is written in stanzas with different lines. So you want to convey to your reader that where the line changes. So we do that with a slash, right? And note here, it's space, slash, space. So these are the first two lines of If We Must Die. So you have the first line, space, slash, space, the second line, and then again, no period here. You have parentheses, the poet's last name, comma, lines, lowercase, 1 to 2, hyphen in between, close parentheses, period here. That's like a nice, beautiful, crisp, clean citation, right? Quote tag there, makes me happy. This is just, I'll tell you about it. I don't think you'll use it very much, but just so you know, if you were to try to indicate a new stanza, like there's a line from one stanza, the next line is from the next stanza, just use 2 slashes to indicate that. Everything else is the same. Okay, so we have about a little over 10 minutes left, and you could finish this for homework. You might be able to knock this out, though, by the end of the period, though. I want you to try applying these skills that I just went over, embedding quotes properly. So what you could do is look at either the poem we did today, If We Must Die, or the poem we did yesterday, Still I Rise, whichever you prefer, and pick a quote from it. I don't really care which quote, doesn't really matter. You probably want to pick something that has some literary devices in it. But I want you to apply these embedding techniques. So you're just going to write 3 sentences. First sentence will introduce the main idea of the quote. The second sentence will include the quote, has to have a quote tag in the beginning, middle, or end, and then it needs that proper in-text citation. And then you'll end with a sentence that comments or explains the quote. And then, just make sure you're following all those rules that I went over. Have the tag, have the slash. I do want you to have a quote that's multiple lines, right? So you should have at least 1 slash in this exercise. Space, slash, space. And then at the end, you have your in-text citation. No punctuation unless it's a question mark or exclamation point. Lines, lowercase, a line length with a hyphen in between, period at the end. So this is just an example for you. You can find this exercise in Canvas. It's called mini paragraph analysis. So you can do that now. It's a 10-point homework grade. Basically, if you do it perfectly, I'll give you 10 out of 10. If you have 1 mistake, I'll give you a 9 out of 10. If you have 2 or more mistakes, you'll have an 8 out of 10. So the PowerPoint's in there as well. So refer to the PowerPoint and just follow this model of how to do this properly. Okay. Questions? Yeah, initially I had this due at 3:30, but because you don't have a whole lot of time in class, I pushed it back. You could probably do it now. I mean, do it as soon as you can. Do it by the end of the day. That's great. But make sure it's in by 8 a.m. on Monday, the beginning of school on Monday. Okay. So you can get started on it. I'll hang up here if you have any questions.